Night fell over Mortain, and the sky was still burning. German artillery thundered in the distance, lighting the horizon with orange veins. In the shattered fields below, a Sherman tank lay crippled, tracks twisted, armor scorched, smoke leaking from its turret. Around it, the ground was littered with metal, mud, and silence. Sergeant Peter "Wrench" Kowalski stood beside the wreck, his face blackened with grease and soot. His unit had already pulled back. The order was clear: abandon everything that couldn't move. But he didn't move either. He just stared at the tank, at the wreckage that had once been his crew's home. A private called out, "She's done, Sarge. Leave it." Kowalski didn't answer. He ran his hand along the armor, feeling the cold steel as if checking for a pulse. "She ain't dead yet," he muttered. He pulled off his gloves, grabbed a wrench, and climbed inside. The interior was chaos. Wires hanging like vines, shattered gauges, the faint smell of fuel and death. He dragged out what was left of the driver, said nothing, and started working. Through the night, under sporadic shell fire, he welded, hammered, and cursed. He scavenged parts from 3 other wrecks nearby. A track wheel from one, an engine valve from another. Sparks flew like fireflies. The sound of his torch echoed through the valley, defiant and strange. Men in nearby foxholes watched him from afar. Some whispered that he'd lost his mind. Others swore he was performing a kind of ritual, a man trying to resurrect the dead. Rain began to fall just before dawn. The tank sat half open, patched together from the remains of its brothers. Smoke still drifted from its exhaust. But now there was a rhythm to it. A heartbeat. Kowalski climbed onto the turret, turned the ignition, and slammed his palm against the starter. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared, deep, raw, alive. From the hills above, soldiers turned their heads. A tank that had died 12 hours earlier was moving again. Kowalski grinned through the smoke. "Told you," he shouted, voice hoarse. "She just needed convincing." By midday, that same resurrected tank would roll back into battle, missing armor, black with soot, and destroy 2 Panthers before the sun went down. The legend of the mad mechanic had begun. In most war stories, when a tank stops moving, that's the end of it. The crew climbs out, the fire consumes what's left, and the machine becomes another blackened husk on the battlefield. Soldiers pass it without looking twice, or in the language of war, a dead tank is just that. Dead. But to men like Peter Kowalski, that idea was nonsense. He used to say, "A tank's like a man. Sometimes it don't die, it just don't feel like getting up yet." His officers called him reckless. His peers called him insane. But the longer the war dragged on, the more they realized his madness kept them alive. The myth of finality, that once a tank was hit, it was finished, existed mostly for comfort. It helped soldiers move on from the wrecks and the friends trapped inside. But on the ground, in the mud and smoke, machines were rarely beyond saving. In Normandy alone, more than 60% of Allied tanks labeled destroyed were later recovered, rebuilt, and sent back into combat, sometimes within a single day. Some came back again and again, stitched together with scavenged parts and luck. Kowalski knew that better than anyone. He had seen tanks burn, only to find that the engine still turned over. He'd patched torn armor with boilerplate, sealed coolant leaks with soap, and welded cracks using scrap metal from destroyed Panthers. He didn't see wreckage. He saw potential. That mindset made him dangerous and indispensable. When other mechanics waited for orders, he moved. When officers wrote tanks off as losses, he went looking for tools. And when everyone else saw insanity, he saw opportunity. He worked like a man possessed, crawling under shellfire to reach broken machines, dragging parts through mud, cursing at steel like it could hear him. His unit began to whisper stories, that Kowalski could bring a tank back from the dead. At first, they said it with sarcasm. Then, after Mortain, they said it with awe. Because that night, when the charmer came back to life, everyone saw something they couldn't explain. They saw a man defy the final rule of mechanized war, that death was permanent. And for the first time, soldiers began to believe that maybe the line between madman and miracle worker was thinner than anyone thought. By the summer of 1944, the 2nd Armored Division had become a moving factory. Its tanks, trucks, and half-tracks stretched across the French countryside like an industrial organism, all steel nerves, oil veins, and roaring hearts. Every mile forward left behind a trail of broken machines, smoking engines, and shattered tracks. The tank war in Europe wasn't about glory or marksmanship. It was about maintenance. A single armored division carried nearly 500 tanks and vehicles. And every day, 30 to 40 of them went down, sometimes to enemy fire, more often to the slow, invisible killers, mud, heat, and friction. The numbers were staggering. Each Sherman tank contained over 20,000 mechanical parts, and anyone could stop it cold. The 2nd Armored's field repair crews worked in 12-hour shifts that stretched into 30. The ordnance trucks followed the battle line like vultures, dragging wrecks out of craters, stripping parts from one to save another. They called it the Iron Harvest. Behind the front, repair yards bloomed overnight, chaotic jungles of torn metal, welding sparks, and shouting men. They had cranes made from logs, work tables carved from destroyed barns, and generators patched together with aircraft parts. The air stank of gasoline and sweat. In that chaos, men like Kowalski thrived. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was an alchemist. He could listen to an engine and tell which cylinder was failing. He could pull a transmission from a burned-out wreck and fit it into another tank before dawn. His tools were mismatched, his methods unorthodox, his results undeniable. The Army's manuals said a full engine replacement required 12 hours. Kowalski could do it in 6, under artillery fire. To his commanders, he was both an asset and a problem. He disobeyed procedures, cursed officers, ignored safety rules. But when a tank he'd worked on rolled back into battle, nobody argued. "Every machine has a soul," he once said. "It just needs a reason to keep fighting." That belief made him infamous among both mechanics and tankers. Some called him Saint Wrench. Others just called him crazy. By August 1944, his name carried across the division. If a tank was beyond saving, send it to Kowalski. He'd either fix it or die trying. And then, at Mortain, he met his masterpiece, a Sherman so broken it should have been abandoned. Instead, it became the proving ground for his madness, a patchwork monster built from the remains of others. In the war of machines, he was no longer just a mechanic. He had become the patron saint of impossible repairs. Wars are remembered by battles and generals, but won by the numbers no one talks about. In 1944, the Allied armies in France were burning through machinery faster than any factory in the world could replace it. Steel didn't die from bullets alone. It died from friction, dust, and exhaustion. The numbers were merciless. A tank engine lasted, on average, 7 to 10 combat days before seizing or overheating. Tracks wore out after just 250 miles of movement. Gearboxes cracked from the shock of rough terrain. Every push forward left a trail of broken armor that outnumbered the dead. The 2nd Armored Division's reports were filled with equations of destruction. 40% of its mechanical failures came from clogged filters and transmission burnouts. Each repair meant crawling under 40 tons of metal, often while shells fell overhead. Recovery crews were exposed targets. 1 in 4 ordnance men was wounded or killed during retrieval or field repair. And yet they kept working. They had to. Factories could ship new tanks across the Atlantic, but it took weeks. Repairs done in the field could put a tank back into battle within hours. Every hour mattered. A single Sherman repaired under fire might save an entire infantry platoon pinned down by a German gun line. That was the quiet arithmetic of the mechanics' war. They didn't count kills. They counted revolutions per minute. Every division carried its own rolling workshop. Cranes, lathes, and welding rigs bolted to trucks. They could turn a field of wrecks into a functioning armored column overnight. It wasn't strategy. It was survival by logistics. Kowalski's section worked 12 hours on paper, 18 in reality. They slept beside their engines using tarps as blankets. Coffee and gasoline shared the same smell. Their uniforms were permanently black from oil. He had a saying, "If you're sane, you hide. If you're crazy, you fix." And in that world, sanity was a liability. The job demanded madness, the kind of devotion that ignored fear, exhaustion, and common sense. Some men shot back when fired upon. Mechanics like Kowalski kept turning wrenches while shrapnel rained around them. To them, a running engine was worth more than cover. By the time August ended, every working tank in the division owed its life to someone like him. And when the Charmer broke down at Mortain, it was only natural that he refused to let it die. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing balance. One more machine pulled from the abyss. One more equation made right. The rest called it insanity. He called it maintenance. Mortain, August 7th, 1944. The night was red. The German counterattack had broken through parts of the American line, and the 2nd Armored Division was barely holding. The air smelled of cordite and wet soil. The sky flashed every few seconds from artillery fire that never stopped long enough to call it night. In the middle of that inferno lay a wreck. Sherman M4, serial number 303568. Crew name painted in white cursive on the side. Charmer. Its right track was shredded, one side sunk into a crater. The turret blackened from a near miss. The crew was gone. 2 dead, 1 wounded, 1 missing. Sergeant Peter Wrench, Kowalski, stood over it with a flashlight and a 1,000-yard stare. Command had already ordered all damaged vehicles abandoned before dawn. But he ignored the order. He climbed onto the hull, pried open the engine deck, and stared into the black heart of the machine. The governor was cracked. The radiator was leaking. The differential was split like a bone. Any sane man would have walked away. He didn't. Instead, he grabbed his torch and began scavenging. From a nearby burned-out Sherman, he stripped an intact carburetor. From a half-destroyed German Panther, he ripped out a road wheel. From a rusted T-34 wreck left by the French resistance, he stole a gear coupling that almost fit. It didn't matter that none of it matched. He'd make it fit. He worked through the night like a man possessed. Sparks burst across the field as he welded steel to steel, muttering to himself in a mixture of English and Polish. Each blow of his hammer sounded like defiance. At one point, a private from another unit crawled up to him through the mud. "You can't fix her, Sarge," the boy said. "She's done." Kowalski didn't even look up. "Then so am I." He reworked the drivetrain by hand, cutting alignment joints with a hacksaw, sealing coolant leaks with melted soap. He used engine oil for welding lubricant and his own jacket as padding for a broken suspension spring. All around him the battle continued. The crash of artillery, the scream of shells. Tracer rounds tore through the darkness, lighting up his silhouette like a ghost at work. Men in nearby foxholes swore they could hear him talking to the machine. "Come on, girl. You ain't quitting on me. Not yet." By dawn, his eyes were bloodshot, his body shaking from exhaustion and fumes. He crawled up to the turret, pulled the starter handle, and waited. Nothing. He hit it again. A cough. Then another. Then the deep, ragged growl of an engine catching fire and life. The Charmer was breathing again. The sound cut through the fog like thunder. Soldiers turned to see the impossible. A tank everyone had watched die crawling forward. Smoke pouring from its seams, the engine roaring with fury. Kowalski grinned, teeth black with soot. "Told you she still had fight in her." That morning, the Charmer re-entered the battle, limping but alive. In less than an hour, it destroyed 2 German Panthers that had ambushed an infantry column. When it rolled back into camp, men lined the road, clapping, laughing, shouting. Someone painted new words on its side in thick white paint. "Built by madness." The miracle of the charmer wasn't divine. It was mechanical chaos that somehow aligned. Every decision Kowalski made that night, every improvisation, every part stolen from a dead tank, should have destroyed the machine. Instead, the mistakes canceled each other out. When engineers examined the charmer weeks later, they couldn't believe it had run at all. The left suspension used a Panther wheel welded onto an American bogie arm. The gearbox alignment was off by nearly 3 degrees. The engine mount was replaced with steel rods scavenged from a T-34 frame. None of it matched regulation. And yet, in performance trials, the tank outmaneuvered standard Shermans. It turned tighter, climbed faster, and absorbed recoil more smoothly. How? Because Kowalski's mad rebuild had accidentally rebalanced the machine. The asymmetry reduced track tension on rough terrain, the mismatched suspension spread weight differently, and the improvised gearbox shift created a more aggressive torque curve. He had, unknowingly, solved one of the Sherman's biggest weaknesses: poor traction and unstable cornering. It wasn't precision that made it work. It was error, multiplied by instinct. The charmer became an engineering anomaly, a Frankenstein machine whose flaws gave it new life. In modern terms, its mechanics called it feedback harmony, small deviations that accidentally reinforced one another instead of collapsing the system. Detroit engineers later ran the numbers. Statistically, a configuration like Kowalski's had a 1 in 10,000 chance of functioning, a 1 in a million chance of performing better. But it did both. Some said it was luck. Others said it was obsession. Kowalski would have said it was just stubbornness. If it moves, it works. If it works, it fights. The result was a tank faster, steadier, and stranger than anything the manuals allowed. It wasn't supposed to exist, but it did, because one man refused to accept that machines die just because people tell them to. And the moment that engine roared back to life, something in the 2nd Armored Division changed. The mechanics began to look at wrecks differently. They stopped seeing corpses and started seeing puzzles. Kowalski's madness had rewritten the math of the battlefield, not through theory, but through defiance. After Mortain, the charmer became a ghost story on treads. Soldiers whispered about it in foxholes, mechanics swore by it in workshops. Every man in the 2nd Armored Division knew the tale of the tank rebuilt in the dark by a madman who wouldn't quit. When it rolled out again weeks later, patched and repainted, it no longer looked like a Sherman. Extra track links welded to the sides gave it a jagged, armored grin. The German road wheel on the left side spun like it belonged there. The mismatched paint, American olive, Soviet green, and Panther gray, gave it a strange, almost predatory look. It was ugly, but alive. The crews who drove it said it moved differently. It responded faster, turned sharper, and felt lighter on rough ground. When they fired the gun, the recoil didn't shake the hull as violently as before. Nobody could explain why. They just called it Wrench's monster. Kowalski stayed with it, riding as its chief mechanic and gunner. He refused to hand it over to anyone else. To him, it wasn't a vehicle anymore. It was something between a comrade and a confession. "She's part of me now," he said, and everyone believed him. Through the fall of 1944, the charmer fought across northern France and into Belgium. It became the first tank to break through the Siegfried Line in its sector, survived 3 direct hits, and was still operational by the end of the month. Infantry units began calling it the lucky tank. The mechanics corrected them. Not lucky, stubborn. Each time it returned from battle, it bore new scars, bullet holes, scorch marks, missing panels. Kowalski patched them with whatever he could find: sheet metal from burned-out trucks, armor from enemy wrecks, even door panels from a French farmhouse. Every repair made it stranger and stronger. By November, the legend had outgrown the man. Commanders joked about bottling whatever fuel kept Kowalski running. He worked until he bled, slept beside the tank, and refused medical leave even after shrapnel tore through his arm. "She needs me," he said simply, and went back to welding. The charmer became a symbol of the division's spirit. that no machine, no man, no unit was ever truly finished. When morale dropped, soldiers pointed to it and said, "If that thing's still fighting, so can we." It was more than a tank. It was defiance made of steel and sweat. And somewhere inside its patched armor, amid the dents and scorch marks, lay the quiet proof that madness and genius were sometimes the same engine, just tuned differently. December 1944. The Ardennes. Snow swallowed the roads and the sky hung heavy with gray. The 2nd Armored Division was exhausted, spread thin along a frozen front. The German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. In that storm of ice and fire, the charmer rumbled on, black smoke curling from its exhaust. Its mismatched armor was now coated in frost, its paint chipped to bare steel. Inside, the air reeked of oil and sweat. Kowalski sat behind the gun, coughing into a rag, his hands trembling but steady when they touched metal. They had been fighting for 48 hours straight. The engine barely held together, but it still roared when he hit the throttle. Every clang, every vibration was familiar, the heartbeat of the monster he'd built. That morning, the charmer was assigned to cover a retreating infantry platoon near Bastogne. Snow drifted across the valley, muffling sound. Then came the shape of enemy armor moving through the haze. 3 Panthers, dark and patient. The first shells struck near their position, spraying snow and mud. The second tore through a nearby half-track. Radio chatter broke into panic. The Americans were pinned. Kowalski's commander shouted, "We're outgunned! Fall back!" He shook his head. "Not her," he said. "She doesn't back up." He jammed the gear shift forward. The charmer lurched out of the tree line, its patched armor groaning. It moved faster than it had any right to. The gun thundered, one shot, then another. The first round clipped a Panther's track. The second hit dead center. Flames burst through the snow. German guns zeroed in. A shell slammed into the charmer's side, tearing through its improvised armor. Kowalski's crew screamed for him to get out. He didn't. He kept loading. Smoke filled the cabin. Fire licked through the floorboards. The tank was dying, but still fighting. Kowalski climbed into the driver's seat, his face streaked with soot. "One more," he muttered. "Just one more." He drove straight into the line of enemy armor, firing until the ammunition ran dry. The charmer shuddered, stopped, then erupted in flame. When reinforcements arrived hours later, they found the tank blackened but upright, frozen in place, its barrel still pointing toward the enemy. Inside, Kowalski's body was fused to the metal controls, a wrench still clutched in his burned hand. They covered him with his jacket, the same one he'd used once to patch the suspension spring. The charmer was never moved. The soldiers left it there, half buried in snow, a shrine of twisted metal and willpower. For weeks afterward, men said they saw its outline through the fog, a tank that refused to stop moving, even after the man who built it was gone. They found his wrench frozen to the controls, welded there by heat and ice. It became the relic of a man who had refused to let go. Not of his machine, not of the fight, not of the idea that nothing was beyond saving. When word spread through the division, men didn't mourn with silence. They laughed. The kind of broken laughter soldiers use when words aren't enough. "Of course he went out with the engine running," one said. "He probably tuned it on the way to heaven." Command filed it as a loss in the morning reports. 1 tank destroyed, crew KIA, field repair impossible. But among the men, a different entry was written. Wrench fixed it too well. It wouldn't die without him. The line between madness and genius had always been blurred in war. Kowalski simply erased it. His obsession was more than technical skill. It was defiance against entropy, against the logic that said broken things stay broken. In a world ruled by statistics and attrition, he believed in something fragile and human, that willpower could bend steel. The charmer was never recovered. Snow buried it. Then spring revealed only rust. But the story endured. The mad mechanic who built a legend out of wreckage. Every mechanic who came after knew his name. When a tank sputtered and groaned, someone would mutter, "Give her the Kowalski treatment," and keep working. He had become more than a man. He was a myth, welded into every wrench that turned under fire. In the end, it wasn't luck or brilliance that made him a legend. It was obsession, that dangerous, beautiful force that drives a person past fear, past exhaustion, past reason. Madness and genius may be opposites in peace, but in war, they're the same engine running at full throttle. And somewhere in the Ardennes, when fog rolls thick over the frozen trees, soldiers still swear they can hear it. A faint mechanical heartbeat, a ghost coughing to life, the charmer rumbling once more. Peter Wrench Kowalski never saw himself as a hero. He wasn't chasing medals or glory, just motion. He believed that as long as a machine could move, so could he. In war, that was enough. The charmer never made it to any museum. Its steel rusted into the soil of the Ardennes, feeding the ground it once defended. But its story lived, passed between mechanics, whispered in workshops, retold every time someone refused to give up on a hopeless engine. Because Kowalski proved something no blueprint ever could, that the line between madness and genius is drawn by results. Every war leaves behind men like him, the ones who see possibility in ruins, who can't stop fixing even when everything else has fallen apart. They don't make speeches. They make things work.